What were the things we were looking for when we were homestead shopping? Stay tuned to find out. I've gotten the question a few times from different viewers asking us about how we made our move onto the homestead, what were the things we were looking for when we bought the homestead, how did we make all that work. Viewer Katrina asked if we could talk about why we chose the state and the area that we did. She asked, did you always live or have roots there? Any questions or check boxes you had for determining your land? Basically, if you were coaching someone looking from scratch, what are some things you might consider thinking about? A few weeks ago, I did a video called How We Became Idaho Homesteaders. In that video, I talked about how we moved from Atlanta to Idaho, how we made that transition, why that came about. But one thing I failed to discuss in the video was the roots. We didn't have any in Idaho. In fact, we didn't even know a single person that lived in Idaho when we moved here. No friends, no family. We were definitely pioneers in the move out here. It was only after we moved out here that both my dad and then later my mom decided that they wanted to move out here too. I knew that it would be very difficult to be trying to find our forever homestead while living in Atlanta and then moving directly from Atlanta to the homestead. The plan that I came up with was that we would rent in town and use that time to learn the area, figure out which part of the region would be good for us, what we liked, what we didn't like, really narrow that down and then start looking for a specific homestead. Katrina is just one of several viewers who have had questions about finding a homestead, how to make that happen. So I'm going to share with you what our criteria was for looking for a homestead. I'm going to also share some of the stuff that I wish I had done differently. Things I know now that I wish I knew then. And I'll preface by saying the search for the homestead was a long, exhausting process. It took 1.5 years before we found this place, and then almost a whole nother year before we actually moved on to the homestead. But with that said, let's get into the property checklist. Of course, the first thing you need to determine is the budget. That really goes without saying, and we're not going to get into the details of finances in this video, so we're going to put that on the shelf for now. So that brings us to size. How much acreage? In addition to having these guys, our homestead goals included having sheep, pigs, and eventually cattle. Also, being a student of permaculture had me wanting to do this in a sustainable manner, meaning we had enough land to support the type of livestock we wanted to raise, and that we were doing it in the correct holistic context. I think so much homesteading can be done in the 1, 2, 3, up to 5 acre size, but having cattle I felt required a little bit more land, even with the miniature breeds. I researched the Dexter cattle at that point and knew that they were an appropriate homestead scale cattle. They required a lot less resources than a normal sized bovine. With all that in mind, we decided 10 acres would be our absolute minimum. I felt that any smaller and we would probably not be able to raise the cattle in the manner that I wanted to. We would probably have to be bringing in a lot more hay than I wanted to. The next thing I was looking for was a property that didn't have obvious signs of having been sprayed with herbicides. Seeing manicured properties that looked like golf courses or the typical suburban chem lawn, highly manicured properties like that tend to be heavily controlled by herbicides, and knowing that we were going to be raising a lot of our own food here on the property, that pretty much excluded them from consideration. When we came to see this property, I saw it was loaded with noxious weeds, bracken fern and tansy, knapweed. When I saw that, it was apparent that this property had not been managed with herbicides in a long time. The next thing is zoning. This is huge. It's really important that if you plan on raising livestock, that you find a property that is zoned agricultural or rural. What I was finding was there were a lot of properties on the outskirts of town that were still zoned suburban, and with that came zoning regulations that really limited one's ability to have livestock. So always check the zoning regulations. Next up, CCRs, also known as covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I highly recommend that you avoid having any CCRs on the property that you buy. CCRs are basically the same thing as an HOA. These are legally binding agreements that property owners enter in with their neighbors, and when they sell their property, it gets passed on to the new owner. These restrictions can be as aggressive as any HOA, meaning they can tell you what animals you can or cannot have. The CCRs can tell you what you can and cannot use your land for. There was a property that we were considering less than 2 miles from here, so it's the same general rural area, though this property had CCRs, which is why we didn't consider it after learning that. The CCR stated that you could not have any pigs on the property, and you were limited to, I think, 2 horses, some chickens, no roosters. It was crazy. Why would you move way out to the country and put those limits on yourself? We were trying to leave the city, move to the country to increase our personal freedom, not to continue having HOA restrictions on us. So CCRs, no good, avoid them. Next on the checklist, road access. Though most of our road is covered in snow, you can see right here that we live off a dirt road. This is not uncommon at all in rural settings to have a dirt or gravel roadway. Sadly, many of the rural roads that we were driving down while looking for properties, they were in terrible shape. It was really awful driving down them. It was really hard on our vehicle. It just wasn't a pleasant experience driving down them. So we wanted to make sure if we were gonna live off a dirt road, it had to be fairly well maintained. Also, we wanted to be around well-maintained county roads for snow plowing services. Up until we had the real heavy rains of last fall, our dirt road was actually in pretty good shape. But the combination of our neighbors having a lot of trucks back here to build their shop in the fall, and all the rain we got, we're getting a lot of these ruts developing, which is really hard on the vehicles. So not only was the quality of the road access important, but also the terrain of the road access. And what I mean by that is the road steep or is it relatively flat, just kind of undulating? Being in a northern climate, these things are important. With really steep roads, it can really hinder one's ability to have ingress or egress during the winter. For me personally, this wasn't a big deal because I thought that I won't need to leave the homestead very often. It probably won't be an issue for me. But Ashley still needed to be able to leave to go to the airport fairly regularly and get home. So for us, we needed something that was lower in altitude, which means less snow, and also not steep. It didn't have to be necessarily flat, but just not steep.
One of the things that was really important to me was access to the airport, because I travel almost every week and didn't want to have to drive too far. For me, proximity to the airport is a big deal.
That's a lot of information. So before we continue, let's take a quick chicken intermission. The next point for consideration, proximity to railroad tracks. In our region, railroad tracks are everywhere, which means lots of railroad crossings, which means loud train noise. Many good properties I was considering were quickly eliminated when I saw that they were really close to the train tracks, more importantly the train crossings. So finding a property as far away as possible from a train crossing was on the list of considerations. Proximity to town and groceries. For us, access to a good grocery store with organic produce was a big consideration. And also the time it takes to get there and back. We didn't want to have to drive more than 30 minutes each way to get to the grocery and back. Sure, a big part of homesteading is raising your own food, but that doesn't happen overnight. That doesn't even happen your first year. It's something that you gradually build up to over time. Another question, can we build on it? The first vision we had for homesteading was we were going to build our own house. Since we wanted to build, we needed to make sure we found a property that was suitable for building. There are plenty of very affordable, large acreage properties out there that are on top of the mountain or almost on top of the mountain. There aren't really any good building sites, access is difficult, and it's just cost prohibitive to try and build there, and that's why the properties are so affordable.
Internet access. Internet access is very important to me because I work from home a couple days a week. So I need to do teleconferences, and I need to upload files and email and all that. So for most people in rural areas, there are not a lot of options. There's satellite, and then there's dial-up, and then microwave. And satellite doesn't really work that well in an area where you get snow. If you have satellite TV, you probably know when you get ice on it, it does not work. And then dial-up is not even funny. No. The third option is microwave. And we're looking for a place that might have good reception for that. And because there are a lot of mountains around us, fortunately, we get pretty good reception here in the valley. But because it ended up being kind of pricey in the fall, we haven't hooked it up yet. So we'll probably do that pretty soon.
Another thing we had to consider was the potential for future development. We did not want to be moving into an area that was only going to be turned into strip malls and subdivisions after a few years of living there. And the last point on our priority checklist was neighbors. Not just the proximity to neighbors, but what kind of lifestyle do they have? For example, one property we looked at and almost bought, it was an undeveloped piece of land right next to another young couple. We got pretty serious about buying the property, so we thought we should go talk to the neighbors. When we talked to them, we found out that they were in the process of installing a professional scale firearm range on the property. They were both competitive marksmen in both pistol and rifles. And they also had a lot of friends that were as well. With our future plans consisting of raising livestock, we didn't want to be right next to a shooting range. I think this would cause a lot of stress for the animals and probably some stress for us as well. You don't want to be hearing gunshots going off today. So all those were our top considerations, but we also had a wish list. The nice to haves were having water features such as a pond or a creek on the property. Also on the wish list was relatively flat land, having a well for well water, nice views. Later down the road, our search criteria did change a little bit because Grandma decided that she wanted to move out here. So we started looking for a place on which we could build our house that met all of our other criteria, that had a guest house on it already that Grandma could live in. And with all these things in mind, we searched for over a year and a half, but eventually we found this place and it really fit everything we were looking for in the property based on what we were looking for at the time. But all that was based on what I knew then, not what I know now. Here are the things I didn't get right or I wish I had done differently. First of all, we learned almost the complete hard way about trying to build a house. If you're not a contractor with a lot of building experience, if you're not an extreme DIYer, or if you don't have a lot of your own finances to cover the cost, then building a house from scratch is probably not a good idea. Happily, we realized these things before we broke ground and actually started to try to build. Sadly, this happened after we already purchased this property. The original plan was Grandma was going to live in this little house that we live in, and we were going to build. And of course, we're not building now, so we're living in the little house. This next one is a really big one, and that's outbuildings. If I had to do it all over again, we would definitely be buying a property that already had a barn, a shop, outbuildings of any kind, just anything on it. We have nothing here, and though we have shown that you can get by without having the outbuildings, it sure does make things a lot better if you do have them. Same with fencing. I really wish we had gotten a place that already had some kind of perimeter fencing up. Other things on this list, irrigation or more hose bibs, just having water access out in the pasture, that's huge. We don't have any of that. And if you remember earlier, I'd mentioned the bracken fern and the tansy, all the noxious weeds on the property being a really good indicator that the property has not been sprayed, which was a really big plus for us. On the other side of it, I did not know at the time that bracken fern was so toxic to livestock. When I saw the bracken fern, I thought, oh, that's great, we'll just get some goats and they'll eat all that out. Come to find out that it's highly toxic to pretty much all the livestock that would consume it. Well, that's it, guys. Those were the criteria we used to search for our homestead, and also the things I wish we had done a little bit differently. I hope this has been some help for you guys out there that are getting ready to start your homestead search or will be soon. I'm curious to hear from some of you guys who have also been on this journey before that have bought your homesteads. Leave a comment below if there are any criteria you guys use that was different from ours. I'd like to hear maybe some additional thoughts, some other things I may have missed.